The automobile is one of the most important inventions that revolutionized the modern world. In America, the rich history of car culture runs deep as technology continues to shape the future of the industry. Jason Stein, former publisher of Automotive News, is here to share the stories of people passionate about cars, from industry leaders and innovators to car-obsessed celebrities. Buckle up as Jason takes you inside the boardroom, onto the track, and around the bend on Cars and Culture on SiriusXM Business Radio.
Welcome to SiriusXM's Cars and Culture. I'm Jason Stein in Detroit. The world of Formula One is full of interesting characters, all of whom have a wonderful story to tell. From kids on go-karts with dreams to drivers who ultimately live out their goals and aspirations on the track in front of millions. It's filled with talent, ambition, success, and heartbreak. Johnny Herbert was all of that. In the 1980s and 90s, Johnny was going to be the next greatest British racing sensation. The hope for a country obsessed with Formula One.
Formula 3000 motor racing is a highly competitive international sport where the drivers race at speeds of up to 160 miles an hour. In the motor racing world, it's the stepping stone to Formula One, the ultimate goal for would-be racing champions, but only the very best make it. In 1988, all eyes were on Britain's Johnny Herbert, Formula 3000's most promising driver.
He was a talented driver with all the tools, and even made good on that promise when he finished as high as fourth place in the driver's standings in just his fifth year in the sport. What's more, he is a 24-hour Le Mans champion, driving a Mazda to the checkered flag in 1991. All the more remarkable considering that Herbert wasn't supposed to race again after suffering a career-threatening injury a few years prior when he was caught up in a major accident while running Formula 3000. As a then-champion hopeful, he faced the threat of amputation.
Johnny was actually trying to get ahead. He actually got ahead of Fortec going up onto the Grand Prix circuit, and then the incident happened.
We was doing about 165 miles an hour, and I could just see out the corner of my eye through the mirror that there was a car coming up the inside, but there was only room for half a car. We made contact, and the arm curve just came up just so quick. I just remember a lot of sort of banging, and I remember my head being thrown around and the car spinning around, and looking down, and all the steering wheel had disappeared, and that must have gone through my legs and out the front.
Miraculously, no one was killed in the crash. Most drivers were able to walk away from their cars. But Johnny was seriously injured. His legs had taken the full impact after the front of his car had been ripped away.
After multiple surgeries and months of physiotherapy, Johnny Herbert returned to the track in triumphant style, although his driving form would be altered permanently due to the injuries sustained in the crash. After a series of trips through various other F1 teams, including a stint as the teammate to Michael Schumacher during that very successful fourth-place team finish, Johnny Herbert eventually moved on. Following his Formula One career, he was in multiple racing series before landing at Sky Sports, where he was an announcer for nearly a decade, from 2012 to 2022. His view is a unique one, having sat in a seat as well as serving as a commentator on the sport. As the F1 season begins with testing this month, what is his view on the state of the sport? Who is the odds-on favorite to take the 2023 title? And what's the inside story behind the public figures we've grown to like or loathe? Formula One and its effect on culture from the perspective of an insider. In a rare taping in front of a live audience, we sit down with Johnny Herbert on the sidelines of the Toronto Auto Show, an event hosted by the Canadian Automobile Dealers Association. Cars and Culture on the road in Canada with a driver who once raced in Canada.
Hi, I'm Johnny Herbert, and this is Cars and Culture with Jason Stein.
Excellent. Great to be in Toronto with you. Today's kind of a cool day. I mean, Mercedes has come out with its new W14. It's all black. They've gone back to that.
Yes. Good.
George Russell's birthday today.
Yeah.
He just turned 25.
Scary. How young they are, my lord.
Right. Well, he's 25, and I'm gonna talk about the rest of them who are also in that same age range. But let's talk about Formula One in general, because when you were racing around in Phoenix,
yes,
most might not remember the Phoenix race.
It wasn't one of the most famous ones.
Who here remembers the Phoenix race in America and how well attended it was?
1989.
1999. Formula One was a little different in North America, right?
Yes.
So let's talk North America. There's a lot to cover here. You've got to be amazed at how far it has come in this country.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah. I go back to 1989, and I remember walking into the circuit on Sunday morning with my wife, and there was an elderly couple walking down the street, and they sort of recognised our accents. Said, "Oh yeah, where are you from?" I said, "Yeah, we're from the UK." "Yeah, what are you doing here?" I said, "We're here for the Formula One, the Grand Prix." "What's that?" And they said, "Well, we're going off to see an ostrich race." And that was more popular than the Formula One race.
The ostrich race.
The ostrich race. So it just shows how
Who won that?
the American might. I've got no idea, no idea, Mr. Ostrich. But it was not popular with Americans because they didn't really sort of understand it. And Bernie Ecclestone tried for many, many years to try and get Formula One more popular, and it never happened. And the only thing that's been able to achieve that is Netflix.
Yeah.
And the Drive to Survive. And it's brilliant because it's just brought in a completely different generation, to be perfectly honest. And I've only noticed it in the last couple of years, especially when I go to Silverstone. Always saw it in Japan, where the parents are bringing in their kids. That was when I was racing. But then it's those kids who are then bringing in their kids in the next generation. And now I never saw that anywhere else. And I saw that for the first time at Silverstone last year. So it's starting to develop where the younger generation are getting interested in the sport, and the families are sort of helping that by bringing the youngsters along. So
you mentioned Bernie, and obviously his impact on the sport cannot be overstated.
Sure.
But there's also the feeling that without him, Liberty Media and Stefano pulled the curtain back on the sport. Now all of a sudden we had access to these drivers. We understood what they were thinking in the paddock. We understood the rivalries.
Yes.
Is that what it did? The behind the scenes and the
definitely,
yeah.
Definitely. I think there was a time, if you do the Michael Schumacher Domination years when he was at Ferrari,
right.
It turned a lot of people off because they knew as soon as they sort of turned on the TV or they were at the circuit watching, they knew it was predictable that he was going to be winning the race at the end of the day. So things have changed in a much more positive way. And I think the only thing with Bernie, the only criticism, if you want to do criticism with what Bernie tried to achieve, he did a brilliant thing for Formula One sort of in the late 70s, early 80s. And he really did move Formula One into a very, very worldwide brand, for example. But then I remember this is probably, 15 years ago, something like that. He had Facebook go into his office, had a presentation about using the platform, and then eventually been able to bring in the new generation. So they started it off, and after 1 minute, he went, stop. I've got no idea what you're showing me on this screen. I've got one question for you. How much are you going to pay me? And that was Bernie's problem of not understanding the social media world and not then allowing it to be able to come through over a little bit of a time period. He wanted it to happen now. He wanted that payment up front. But the Netflix thing with Formula One, who I believe paid initially for that Netflix documentary to sort of come into effect, has changed the game. But Bernie didn't get that. But that's just a generational thing and not sort of fully understanding what can be done in a different way. Like you said, it's understanding what the drivers are doing and how they react behind the scenes. Generally, we never ever saw that.
Isn't it true that Lewis Hamilton really wanted to begin tweeting and sending out his thoughts to the social media world, and Bernie told him, well, you can continue, but I'm going to charge you per tweet?
I don't know if that's 100% true, but it is Bernie Ecclestone we're talking about. So it probably was. But again, that was just the issues he had. He was always very restricted on what could be done at a racetrack. And there was a point where when you went onto the grid, all that were there were the marshals, who were sort of just putting the cars onto the grid, and the teams and the drivers. That was it. Now, once again, like we used to have probably I wasn't there in the 80s, but I think the 80s, they were absolutely packed the grids before the race. And I remember in Montreal, actually, when I first came here in 1991, they were packed, absolutely packed. That disappeared, but that's all back again. But it gives it a really good vibe. It looks much better
on TV.
Well, sure,
and there's a bit of an excitement. It sort of really spices it up before it's even the wheels have turned.
It looks great when Brad Pitt's walking through the paddock in Austin, as an example.
Yeah, sure.
Or now the monetization of it, they're charging for that access, and you can go on the back of a flatbed and go around the track as well before the race even starts.
Again, there's all these little bits that have just sort of energized Formula One. But I have to say, the racing has been pretty good as well. Again, with the little changes that they've done, it has enabled the drivers to do a better job when they're actually on the racetrack as well. And that's something that was stalling, because Bernie's wanting the big manufacturers on board was very important to him. But it was always them dictating. It's still a little bit of that going on at the moment, but it's not them now creating the next generation of cars, like these ground effects cars that we've got now. That was through Formula One and Liberty Media and Ross Brawn and Pat Simmons and his team to be able to get this car that allows closer racing. So
160 times you took the track, correct?
Yep.
How many times did you talk to Bernie?
Yeah, not every single Grand Prix, but his door was always open. He was always willing to sit down with you. And I remember one time I did a game. It was Johnny Herbert's Grand Prix, and the guy that did it was one of these characters. You want to call it Johnny Herbert's F1 race game.
There's a video game.
The video game, yeah. And I said, you got to be careful with the F1. You can't use the F1. Don't worry about it. He had the opinion that I'd do it, then he'll fight it afterwards. Yeah. So I went to Bernie and I said, I've got this guy who wants to do this game, and we're sort of very close to sort of finishing it off, but he wants to call it F1. He said, Johnny, that's okay. I won't come after you. And that's all he said. So it's classic Bernie's way. And to be honest, I never heard from anybody, but we never used F1, so that's probably why.
You never did.
Johnny Herbert's Grand Prix. It was a terrible game. Terrible game.
You mentioned Montreal. How important is the, they have talked through the years of the three M's, Melbourne, Monaco, and Montreal as being the three favorite places that the drivers like to go.
Yeah.
You concur?
Yes, and I think we're very lucky that Canadians love their motorsport. And I think with Gilles Villeneuve, very, very, years ago in the 70s, and Gilles was very, very special to my heart when I was a karter. Gilles, it didn't matter if he had 4 wheels on his wagon, 2 or 3 or whatever it was, he always wrang its neck. And that was something I really did sort of enjoy seeing. So the history of the sport is very good here in Canada. It's great when you go to Montreal, because it's not just what happens on the island and where the circuit is, it's actually what happens downtown as well. There's a big effort to make the whole weekend special for the race fans that go there. And of course, then when eventually they get there on a Friday, Saturday, and especially on a Sunday, there's a brilliant vibe. And I think every year we come back, I don't think there's ever been really a drop in popularity. It's always had that, which has been nice.
Speaking of brilliant vibes, Miami was its own vibe as well, and I'm sure Las Vegas in November will have its own vibe. Yeah. What does unlocking the U.S. market mean for Formula One ultimately? And I'm sure there may be more cities to come.
Yeah, well, I think there's definitely a willingness to obviously spread its wings. There's there's talk about doing sort of 26 or so races in the future. A lot of people say that's a bit tough. I don't think it's a big issue. From when I was racing, for example, we used to do probably 35 test days during a season, and then we had about 17 Grand Prix themselves. But the mechanics used to sometimes work 24 hours the whole way through a weekend, every day, because there was engine change. You had a sort of an engine you had on the Friday, you change it to the qualifying engine on the Saturday morning, you change it to a qualifying engine for qualifying, you take that one out, you put a race engine in for the Sunday. So there was a hell of a lot of work. That's all very, very different now. But I think overall the challenge for the drivers is the same as it was. But having America, I think, just brings this new dynamic to Formula One. I think it's a very important market for sure. They've always liked their motorsport anyway. North America, even sort of Central South America, sort of like their Formula One. So we're very fortunate from that point of view. But it's just one of those markets. When you talk about Miami, you talk about Las Vegas. It's just one of those drop-in sort of places you go anyway, to Vegas, but to have a Formula One race on the strip
on a Saturday night,
on a Saturday, is going to make it. It's going to be very, very special. And I think everybody's very aware, because of the brands that are involved with Formula One. The American market is a very important one at the same time. So they've done it through, like Red Bull have had their sort of NASCAR team, Honda and Ford have always been involved with IndyCar or Champ Car in the past. But everybody knows that Formula One is the ultimate of motorsport, and you've got to be able to try and promote that brand. In America is one place that it hasn't quite been able to achieve. Now it's in a very, very good place to make the whole show better and engaging for people. And I know the whole of North America, engagement is a very, very important thing. You know, when I go in the city here in Toronto, and when you see where the ice hockey stadium is and the basketball stadium and everything else, down in America, it's the same thing. You know, they're the big draws, but
right.
You're competing against those sports as well. So Formula One has been very, very fortunate that through sort of a documentary, it's really sort of opened people's eyes.
Are there more expansion opportunities, do you think? I mean, there's a rumor of New York City.
Yeah, again, the expansion is one thing. There is something about burnout for the people that do travel around in the show. But as I said, I think there's a balance of where they'll be able to sort of have less time working on the cars, which I know is something that's going to happen this year. It's going to be a little bit less time they have, and I think that will only help people have the energy to get through the whole season. And again, it can spread its wings, and maybe there's just going to be a little bit of rotation, maybe, where they can sort of almost pick and choose where they feel at that present time it's the right place to go. And of course, at the present time, it's America.
Let's talk about what you've seen over the last couple of years, what you expect this year as testing begins. And who knows? Well, you definitely have some opinions, which we're going to get to.
Yeah.
What storyline intrigues you the most? Is it Max repeating? Is it George Russell and Lewis Hamilton tussling for the top spot? You said recently Lewis is going to come back fighting hard this year, given what happened last year. Is it Ferrari attempting to overtake in the constructors?
Well, I'm in Canada and I go to Montreal every year. There's always a lot of red shirts. We got a lot of Ferrari fans in here. Oh,
I'm sure.
Not quite as many. Yeah, not as many as I thought. There's going to be a few more than that. I hope that comes together.
Yeah.
You know, they started so well last year. It looked as if they were going to be the team to beat, and then it all went so wrong. A little bit of mistakes from Charles Leclerc, but the strategy calls that Ferrari made last year were just shocking. And it wasn't Bonotto, who's now been changed by Fred Vasseur, never seemed to accept it. He always said, no, we made the right decision. And you sort of go, well, people, even my wife sitting at home was going, what are they doing? What are they doing? And that is a bit of a problem, because sometimes you've got to accept that you're doing the wrong things, but then you've got to change the personnel, I think, to be able to sort of make the right choices, because you're up against someone like Mercedes and Red Bull, especially Red Bull, who are very, very strong when it comes down to strategy. So I hope that comes together for Ferrari can stay within the mix of the Red Bull and Mercedes. The most exciting one for me, I think, is George and Lewis, because I think George is going to be a very, very difficult man for Lewis in the next couple of seasons. I know Lewis is very, very eager to get that 8th after sort of being robbed of that in Abu Dhabi, as we all know. So there are some brilliant battle's going to come our way between those two, for sure. Hopefully, as I said, Ferrari coming into it with Charles Leclerc. And then you've got Max. You know, Max is such an exciting driver. He has his ways, he has his edge. But I think that's what draws people to watch it now, because we have, you know, 3, possibly 4 drivers in it. We never know with Fernando Alonso, let's see with Aston Martin. But I think we have this opportunity of having the new generation, which Max is part of that, I suppose. But then you've got George, who's really going to take it to Lewis. Lewis has still got all the tools that he needs to be able to sort of win races and win a world championship. He needs the car underneath him, which wasn't the case last year. They've kept the same concept. They've changed a bit of the suspension movement, for example, which Red Bull was working on very, very well last year. So that might hopefully bring them back into the game. I think it will. But then, of course, we've got, you know, a little bit further back with the battles, and hopefully we've got those top 3 teams with the 6 drivers who'll be battling it out, and it'd be lovely for another one to sort of sneak in the back door maybe and sort of cause a few issues. Something like Aston Martin, you never know, but Alpine as well, who look as if, from what I understand, have done some very good stuff over the winter time, and they seem to be sort of fully prepared. So there's a lot of lovely stories with the elder statesman, someone like Lewis, coming to the end of his time, but still very hungry to succeed.
It's a generational change, isn't it? I mentioned George turning 25 today. Lando's 23.
Yeah.
Charles is 25. Max is 25.
Yeah.
Pierre Gasly's 27. We're in a whole new era now, aren't we?
Yeah, we are, and it's a good era. They're a good bunch. There were times, even when I was racing, you had sort of the Italians over there, you had the French sort of over there, and then you had the British as well. We had 7. I think there were 7 British drivers at one point in the early 90s, but we never mixed so much together. But this lot do mix together, and that's really nice to see, even on social media posts that we see with George and Alex Albon, for example, and Charles Leclerc having a bit of fun together with Lando Norris as well. And they have this wonderful relationship, which is really refreshing, to be perfectly honest. And then they put the helmets on, but then battle commences when they get in the cars as
Let's talk about Max. You've been watching him since Formula 3 when you described him as a very hard racer, somebody who had a ton of talent. You've also said you think that you really believe that he'll eclipse Lewis in terms of skill.
There's always the generational things, and the man that I loved to watch was Ayrton Senna. And I never thought we'd sort of see anyone better. Then Michael Schumacher sort of turned up and sort of dominated in the way he did. And then Lewis sort of turned up and was the next thing. But each time that's happened, they're better than the last one. And I think Max is in this very, very similar position of his racecraft, his ability to absorb all the pressures that are thrown onto a Formula 1 driver's shoulders, absorb it, and then just deliver every single time he gets on the track, like Lewis does. And that's where the other drivers around them, from a Sergio Perez with Max, George, I think, is probably the one who's going to be able to achieve that. To Carlos Sainz against Charles Leclerc, Carlos can beat Charles, Sergio can beat Max, and George, you're going to have to wait and see, can beat Lewis. Can they do it every single Grand Prix? That's where these guys are very, very special, and that's where, at the moment, Max is unbelievably good now from last year. He'd be better this year, and he'd be better next year, and he would just get better and better and better. But it's this new generation you've brought up that I think will be able to sort of follow him, and then eventually they will be able to jump on his shoulders. And I think we've got just a wonderful future of these young guys that are very, very hungry to succeed. But the man at the moment who's just, I find, unbelievable to watch is Max.
Yeah, the perseverance, the skill, the talent.
Yeah.
Well, in American football, we obviously saw the recently retired Tom Brady.
Yeah.
In Lionel Messi brought Argentina its last World Cup. LeBron James just broke the NBA scoring record.
Yeah.
They're all athletes that are the best of the best in their own way. What separates them from their peers?
I think the difference is in probably all sports, but especially Formula 1, is when I started, just for example, we had mobile phones, but they were just very basic mobile phones. No one texted each other in those days. And then the only way I learnt a circuit, I remember Indianapolis, I think in 2000, was the first time I used a PlayStation to learn the circuit in Indianapolis. Now these guys have the simulators, they have the CFD computers that the guys are using to be able to develop the car. They then have the ability to know a circuit 1,000 times over before they've even got there. So the whole mentality is different. I used to turn up at my first Grand Prix and I had to go around either on a bike or walk around. And then you learnt it actually when you got in the car for the first practice. But the engineers see that as a total waste of time. The driver needs to be totally on it as soon as he gets out there for that very first lap on Friday. But they have all these tools now that enable them to do that. And that's where I think they've evolved into I don't know, almost like the perfect drivers, because they've just got all these tools that they can sort of play with and use it to their advantage once they get in the cars. But not all of them can do that. That's why I said someone like Valtteri Bottas with Lewis Hamilton. Again, someone who could beat Lewis, but he could only do it 2 times a year. But Lewis was able to sort of find a way, and the special ones always do that, I think, in all sports, to find a way of doing it every single time. Okay, Tiger Woods, exactly the same thing. You know, but they change the whole way that you do that particular sport, because it evolves and it just becomes, you know, so much more, I don't know, difficult for the ones who haven't quite got that ability to absorb all that information that's being thrown at them.
Well, Johnny, you probably trained a little differently than they train now, right?
Yeah, did. And that's something, yes, fitness has changed. You know,
right.
I remember we had Gatorade, if I go back to that sort of Phoenix race, we had Gatorade. It was terrible stuff. It was really, I used to drink sort of a bottle of Gatorade, and I was in the toilet every 10 minutes having a wee. It was awful stuff. But that was the very early days of that, where now they're all so fine-tuned with all the food intake that they have and the drinks that they have. And when I was with Michael Schumacher, for example, his trainer, he gave me the same food that Michael had. But that didn't work for both of us, where now everybody has their own ability to have what works for their bodies. And that's where it's changed. And then you get the mental thing that comes into the same time. So everything you take in makes this much, much sharper.
You mentioned Michael and racing alongside him. What was he like?
He was good. He had a very good British sense of humour when he wanted. He was tough as nails when we were in the engineering room. So he was working very hard with his engineer. The one thing that he was very good at as well is if there was he felt there was an issue, and the one story I've got is when I was doing my second Grand Prix, I think in Argentina. It was the first time we'd been back to Argentina for a few years. So on a Thursday we got an hour extra practice, and I was a thousandth of a second quicker than Michael. And as we're walking back after the engineering meeting, he was walking with his wife and my wife, and he sort of said to me, "So, Johnny, there's things that you do that you probably don't want me to see, and there's things I do that I don't want you to see. So, you know, the data, maybe we should think about the data, you know, not sort of sharing the data as much." I said, that's, you know, the data's there because that's the way we go about racing. It's always been there to share so we can sort of improve the process. So he said, yeah, but I'm not sure that that's something I'm sort of willing to do. And then the next day I went in, and Flavio Briatore, who was the team principal at the time, Michael had asked him, he didn't want me to see his data, and he applied that. He could see mine, but I couldn't see his. And that was where
always an edge.
But that was where he was very clever, because he worked with Flavio to take all the energies away from me and other teammates that he'd been up against as well, to then actually be able to sort of do the job he did on the track. And it was, you know, unbelievable what
He was about as even keel as it gets, right?
Yeah. But he had his edge. You know, he had, you know, Damon Hill, when they sort of crashed into Damon, he won the World Championship because of that. Jacques Villeneuve, in that incident he had in Jerez, where he tried to take him out. Didn't quite work out, thankfully, and Jacques won that championship. But there was an edge. And the only other driver I find, maybe Fernando Alonso a little bit, the only other guy who's got a very, very similar mindset is Max Verstappen. He'd do anything to win.
He can also be a little critical of his own team.
Very much so.
If you watch the races or Drive to Survive, and most have heard him yell over the radio to his own folks. Some might call that passion. Other people may call it I don't know, an uneven temper. What's your view of that? I know you've talked about this before.
Yeah, but it's his way of getting everybody sort of completely and utterly mentally in the right place, because he knows one little slip up could lose him the race, but secondly it could lose him a world championship. And Michael had a very similar mindset to that. And Michael's way of winning a championship was win it as quickly as you possibly could. If he won it in July, he had done his job. For Formula One, it wasn't a good thing, because obviously the championship was all sort of done and dusted. But Max is has a very, very similar way of doing it. I think Lewis does, but it's not something you hear so much. You do hear him criticise the team in strategy now and again, which you never heard that in the very early days of his career when he was at McLaren, for example. But Max will make sure that the team hear that he's not a happy chap. And I think that's probably the best way of doing it, because that is where everybody sort of realises that they've got to up their game. Where Ferrari, for example, last year on the radio, there was a lot of communication between Charles and his engineer discussing what was happening in the strategy. And it was like, the driver should only be doing the job that he's doing, which is driving the car. To then think of extra stuff, strategy, that's not the case. And that's where Max will be very, very hard on his team to make sure that doesn't suddenly become on his shoulders, the pressure.
Are they playing it up a little, knowing that everything is now broadcast all over the place?
There's games, yes. You hear many games that, you hear it more probably from Lewis, actually. Well, my tyres, I'm not sure, guys, these tyres are going to last. And then, unbelievably, they last.
Right.
So it is games that they play to the other teams, but they do it both ways, and that's part and parcel of modern strategy, I guess.
2021 in Abu Dhabi, you were not shy about how you felt about the way that ended, and what happened with Michael Massey.
Yeah.
So Lewis was robbed.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I know Max gets very sensitive when he hears those words about being robbed, but Lewis was robbed, but Max did nothing wrong. You can't blame Max in any way. Some people say, oh, but he should have given it back to Lewis, or they should have reversed the finishing order. But you can't do that. The whole way that the structure was done, it was the wrong decision for Michael Massey. Unbelievably, I don't know how he cocked it up so much. But there was you couldn't change the result in any way. But yes, he was robbed. It was a shame the way that it turned out, because there should have been one extra lap when the safety car was brought in, which he didn't do, and then of course there was only that one lap. And then the one thing I hated as well during that sort of season, which has now been stopped, was where you had Christian Horner and Toto Wolff, but mainly Christian, banging on the radio the whole time, trying to change the result of the race.
Like NFL coaches talking to the referee.
Yeah. And I didn't find that sort of very professional, to be perfectly honest. So it's now been stopped, which is a good thing. Does it make it more engaging for the race fans? I'm not sure, personally. I'd rather it be the drivers show us the wow factor.
You spent 10 years with Sky Sports. Did your comments cost you your job there?
I would not be surprised. I think it does upset people. It's a very sensitive little place to be, and when you sort of tell the truth, I think, as I was saying it, people do get very sort of narked about it. You say, well, yeah, but that's what happened. You can't deny it, but it's something that affects their brand. And it's the brand that is the most important thing. So that's where sometimes possibly that was the case. But I stand by everything I did, because I think I was fair, right. You could argue if I was or not. But I think over my period of sort of time there, yeah, I think I was always fair and open to the decision I made. If anybody wanted to criticise it, fine. But you've got to be. It's like anything. I remember the crash with Lewis in Monza, where Max landed on top of him, and there was all this thing. Oh well, Lewis should have given him more room. And it's like, when they crashed in Silverstone, you were saying Lewis should have moved out of the way, which was probably right the way the rules are written. But Max could have moved out of the way, because it was the same thing. When you're ahead, they always say, right, if you're ahead, that's your corner. If you go to Monza, well, Lewis was ahead, so it's his corner. But he's got to move out of the way this time around. And I was critical of Max from that point of view.
Max stopped talking to Ted Kravitz
last year. Again, the same thing. And that was when he brought out about robbed.
Right.
Where Lewis was robbed, and he took it, really personally. But I don't quite understand why he gets so upset, because it doesn't matter. And if he really, really looks at it, he was lucky. And if he didn't have that luck, he wouldn't have won that first World Championship. So.
Johnny, I want to talk about your racing career for a moment, and in particular the accident that you had. But I want to draw a parallel between the racing injury and the perseverance that you needed to get through that, and perhaps a lesson in perseverance that you're applying to your next chapter now that Sky Sports is over. Can you borrow from that to figure out what you're doing next?
I think so, because it was lovely doing the Sky stuff, but there are still so many other things out there. There's a lot of things that are still within the bubble that you can get involved with talking with race fans that sort of come to that weekend, in the hospitality that they have, for example. You know, you have a lot more, I think, different technology that's coming into motorsport, and Formula E is one of those. So there's always opportunities maybe with Formula E as well. So there's a lot of other things that sort of can be done, and if you're understanding of that and willing to work for it, you know, there is always that chance that you can have fun. I've always enjoyed the talk with the race fans and trying to sort of give a little bit of an understanding of what it's like to be in the cockpit, and you know, what the guys are doing on the racetrack at that given weekend, for example. So I enjoy that, and I always used to get moaned at when I was racing that I was always the last man to leave when we were at a sponsor event, for example. But I found that to be very important, actually, because if it wasn't for those sponsors, if it wasn't for those race fans, I wouldn't have been racing around a track in a Formula One car. So I know how important that is.
When you think back to your racing career, what comes to mind?
I think mainly the accident, which we were going to talk about anyway, but I think that just sort of held me back, and it frustrates me that I made the decision that I made on the restart of that weekend I crashed at Brands Hatch. But I'm very, very happy with how I dug deep to give my chance that shot of getting into Formula One car, because when I had the accident I wasn't in Formula One. I was very, very close. I was the new man that everybody wanted. I did a test before I had the crash at Brands Hatch. Enzo Ferrari wanted to meet me when I went to the Brands Hatch race the following weekend, or that weekend. Frank Williams was there in the Sunday morning. He wanted to have a chat with me. Peter Collins, who was at Benetton at the time, I had a contract with them anyway. And then Ken Tyrrell, he was interested at the same time. So I had everybody in it, and then I had the accident, and then everything sort of changed. But, as I said, I worked so bloody hard to get myself back in a cockpit of a race car. So that was August, I had the crash, and I was back in a race car for my first Grand Prix at the end of February.
That was 1988, right?
That was 1989 when I did. Right. The 88 was the crash, and then 89 was my first Grand Prix, and I finished fourth. And I wasn't even walking at that time. I used to ride around the pits in a red bicycle. That was the only way I could get around. So,
let's just dig into the accident for a second. Scary on-track accident at Brands Hatch. And
yeah, it was a good one, but yeah.
It was a good one.
It was a good one, yeah.
You tore up your ankle. You tore up your feet.
Yeah, both, yeah.
You tell the story of an amazingly humorous moment when you're still on the track amidst the rubble.
Yeah.
Can you set the scene for us?
Well, again, there was a lot going on around me, but I wasn't sort of aware of what was going on in my little bubble. And when the crash happened, it was a guy called Gregor Wojtek who'd always been crashing. The race was stopped. The first part of the race was stopped because Gregor crashed into Roberto Moreno, who was a Formula One driver as well. Then on the restart, and this is the only thing I wish I'd sort of done something different. At Brands Hatch, there's like a dip where pole position is, and I was on pole position. So I thought for the restart, I'd park it slightly up the hill, so when I moved, it would be straight. And I got too much wheel spin. I went down the dip, and I ended up being third going into the first corner. But I wasn't worried because I had a 12-second lead when the first part one of the race was stopped. So I had this 12-second buffer, basically. So I had no problems that I would still be able to sort of win the race as a two-part. And then we clashed wheels, Gregor and us, at the second corner at Druids. Then I got in front of him, and he got a good drive as we went through Surtees onto the Grand Prix circuit. So I knew if I place the car in the middle of the track, he's not going to be able to go left, he's not going to be able to go right, because he's going to have to go on the grass. But he just kept on going on the left-hand side, went on the grass, clipped my rear wheel, then it just turned sort of really sharply left. And unfortunately, the way that Brands Hatch is on the Grand Prix circuit, there's a bridge that sort of links the inner field to Druids. And where the bridge is, the Arbico normally on a normal racetrack would just go down the hill, up the hill, and then you go through Hawthorns. But where the bridge was, it went around the bridge, then came back and then carried on going. But when I got sort of turned left and where the Armco came out, I just hit the Armco head on, and then it just ripped off the front of the car. My legs were hanging out the front and it span around, and then unfortunately I went head on the other side with my legs hanging out, and it all sort of, everything stopped, didn't feel any pain. And then I remember opening my eyes and all I could see, the way you're in the cockpit, was just the top of my knees. So the first thought was, from the knees down, both have gone. So I just remember sort of going, right, knock me out, and then gas on my face and everything else. Then I remember sort of, as I speak now, I can't actually remember it, but I know I said to my engineer, when they finally got there, I said, yeah, is the spare car ready? Get the spare car ready. So, and this is where, and what it was, my left foot is basically hanging off. My right foot, my heel is actually round the side. My toe was sort of ripped off on the left-hand side. But I still, somehow, I sort of kept my humour, because I sort of thought, okay, I've lost my legs, but everything would still be okay the next day. So I went to the hospital. I remember realising, I think after the operation, when my legs were on the hospital bed, they were covered in bandages, but they were red, but it was my feet. So I knew my feet were still there. And then I was on morphine, I think, for that first week. And then I went through this weird stage that I was under a waterfall, naked with my wife, or my wife to my girlfriend at the time, but under a waterfall, beautiful. Everything else, having a nice cuddle and everything else. And then suddenly, like our skins, like banana skin, when you peel the banana, the skin came off. And then we ended up being these monsters that then ate each other. And then we reproduced. And I'd open my eyes and it would stop. And I close my eyes, and like in a dream, you can never really go back to the same place in a dream. Close my eyes, and I go back to the same place where all these bloody monsters are eating each other. And then eventually I had to be taken off the morphine. Yeah. Because it was getting a little bit strong. But
don't do drugs.
Don't do, no. Morphine, you've got to do it. If you're in that predicament, that's got to happen. But then I never had this doubt that I would stop racing. When I knew they were still on, my feet were still on, I knew then I had to sort of work very, very hard to get a chance. I got my contract signed, I think that was August, September. I think October I got the option taken up. I was still in a wheelchair. My legs were still sort of stuck out like this. But that helped, because that allowed me then to sort of work towards getting that first race in Brazil. I had a purpose to do it, yeah. So,
wow.
And it was bloody painful, but I'm glad I did it.
Wow.
So.
A couple more topics, and then we're going to wrap it up here. Michael Andretti into Formula One. What do you think?
I hope it happens. I'm so miffed when I sort of hear the other teams say, oh, we don't really want them to be part of it. And it's just because there is this sort of bundle of cash that they all get their sort of money to be able to go racing, which is absolutely an important thing. But I think it's great that we have someone else coming in. You've got the Andretti name for one, obviously with Mario, Michael having his little time at McLaren. And I think it'd be great to see Cadillac come into Formula One. So I really, really hope that does happen, because I think if we get someone like Andretti coming in, we might actually end up getting a few more teams as well. You know, and is he going to try and beat the big boys? Yeah, of course he is. Yeah, it's going to take a bit of time. It's not an easy thing to be able to get a team. We've seen that with Lawrence Stroll, with Aston Martin. It's going to take time. It's not an easy thing to do. So yes, I hope Andretti gets that entry. I think it's important for everyone.
What does Ford's re-entry mean? I mean, you've got a connection there.
Yeah,
right?
big time. Yeah, my last Grand Prix win, with the old lovely V10 Cosworth that we had, Ford Cosworth. So yeah, brilliant. Again, you know, history of Ford and Cosworth, especially sort of through the late 60s and early 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s as well. You know, it's just brilliant to have that. You know, the timing is fantastic, because everything that's going on in the States, so it's great for Ford that way. And the relationship with Red Bull, you know, what a perfect place for them to be able to start in the championship winning team to beat.
A lot of talk of electric motors and sustainable energy and a transition within the next 3 to 4 years. Mm-hmm. What do you make of all that? What do you think? Inevitable?
Well, yeah, I think it is. I think we all know sort of, you know, the way the world is and how it works and how we need to try and help it get by. And we have a lot of combustion engines sort of, around the world, millions and millions of those. And the technology is something that humans, or whatever you think of how technology goes, always find a way of making things better. And I think if we can work hard, I don't know if it's going to probably hydrogen will probably end up being on big trucks and buses, for example. We've got the electric side that's really good with the Formula E, for example, so that's really good. And then we've got these wonderful hybrid Formula One cars that are the most efficient, combustion engines that we've got out there. But it still needs to, continue trying to get the right ingredients to make the whole show as a whole, as in motorsport, an attractive thing for the younger generation. Because I only know this through my sort of nieces and nephews of how engaged they are actually with the future, and how the green is such a big important part of it. And I think motorsport has always been very good at moving that technology really, really quickly. So that's hopefully something that it will continue to do.
Give me one or two sentences on these drivers, all right?
Yep.
Michael Schumacher.
Yeah, a man that would do absolutely anything to win a race. And I think he definitely achieved that.
Ayrton Senna.
Ayrton Senna was someone that he had a pure way of going racing. He had a little edge to him as well when he crashed with Alain Prost, but pure.
Eddie Jordan.
An absolute fruitcake from Ireland that I would never, ever, ever trust. Never did trust him, still wouldn't today, but love him.
Excellent. Lewis Hamilton.
Lewis Hamilton, again, just a rare being that, has had some tough times in his younger days. He's fought through it. He's become, as equal successful as Michael Schumacher. I hope he gets that 8th. He deserves it.
Fernando Alonso.
There's a man, you're right. He's a very interesting character that excites a lot of people. He still excites me, and it's going to be very interesting to see if he can achieve another race win, and who knows, a world championship with Aston Martin.
Daniel Ricciardo.
A smiley face that he's going to be missed, but I think he's still going to be around, obviously, with his connection now with Red Bull. But things move on.
And Max.
Max, again, there's a wow factor with Max, and I think it's something that wow factor is only going to get stronger and stronger, and he's going to be the man to beat.
1991, you drove a Mazda 787B
Indeed.
To a win at Le Mans.
Sorry for the noise, but yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This year, the 100th running, as I said in the opening.
Yeah, sure.
What does Le Mans mean to you?
Yeah, again, it was, for me, there were always 3 races I wanted to compete in and win. Formula One, that was always the first one on my bucket list. Indianapolis 500, that was always another one which sadly never worked out. And of course then Le Mans. And Le Mans was probably the most toughest race, not physically, but mentally, because it's just 24 hours of, not 24 hours of driving, but it's then getting out of the car after you've done sort of about 3 hours in the car, then trying to sleep. And especially when I did one in 1991, there were 3 Wankel powered Mazdas going around, the most noisiest thing on earth. And you could never go to sleep, because every time the first one went past, you thought, that's probably mine. Then you try and get into a sleep, and then a minute later, the next one would come by, and then again, same thing. And then a minute later, the next one would come by. It was the most punishing mental race that I ever did. But the ultimate is still Formula One anyway.
Well, it's never too late for IndyCar, Johnny.
Yeah, I think that's
you
passed by.
You got some time now.
Thank you. So. Yes, there's an element of that. But no, it's I've been very lucky, very fortunate that career that I've had, especially after when I had that accident. If that had happened in this day and age, I would never have had a career. So I was very lucky. I had Peter Collins, an Australian, who was completely sort of, in love with me, and just gave me that chance to get to that first race and finish 4th in my first Grand Prix. But it's still lovely seeing this lovely generation, as I said, that we've spoken about, because it's just fascinating to me of how they do the job that they do to the height and the pressure, because the pressure they have nowadays is way above what I had didn't have social media. We had probably the BBC, I think Globo from Brazil. I think there was probably TF1, the French, maybe the Italians as well. And that was sort of it. That was all you had. Where now it's a worldwide TV audience from every sort of part of the world. And then you've got the social media on top of it as well. So the drivers have to deal with a lot more stuff than I ever did, that's for sure. But they still have a pretty cushy job.
P4 in 1995, Le Mans winner in 1991, and future IndyCar champion, Johnny Herbert. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks again to my guest today, former F1 driver and Sky Sports announcer, Johnny Herbert. And to see my interview with Johnny, go to the Cars and Culture YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to see nearly 100 interviews. And thanks for listening to Cars and Culture. You can follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook, as well as on Instagram at Cars and Culture SXM, and on Twitter at Cars and Culture. I'm Jason Stein in Detroit. We'll see you down the road.